The first time the aliens cut Jace open, he laughed. It wasn't bravado, it was shock, a wild, panicked giggle bubbling out of him as translucent claws slid through his skin like it was warm wax. Bright blue light flooded his peripheral vision, and a chorus of soft chimes echoed somewhere above his head. The med bay of the Arcadia 7 looked less like a hospital and more like the inside of a seashell. Curved walls, pearlescent surfaces, fluid displays drifting in midair like jellyfish. Jace floated in a gel cradle, naked and weightless, while a cluster of luminescent beings clicked and sang to each other in ultrasonic tones. They smelled faintly of ozone and citrus, with a sharp metallic tang that made the back of his throat twitch. One of them, taller, with a corona of softly pulsing tendrils, leaned close to stare into his dilated pupils. Subject exhibits euphoria during dermal breach. It trilled in translated standard, the voice smooth as a synthesizer. Confirm no distress indicators. Jace wanted to say, actually, I'm freaking out, but the translation field wrapped around his brain like cool mist, misreading the jagged mess of his terror as amusement and curiosity. Invisible fingers crawled across his cortex, tagging his racing heartbeat as excited, his shallow breathing as anticipatory. The scalpel-like limb slid deeper into his abdomen, parting tissue with surgical grace. He felt organs shift like heavy fruit in a torn grocery bag. The pain hit then, white, liquid, immense, and his laughter snapped into a choking scream that never really formed, crushed into nonsense as the translator filtered his agony into what it had been programmed to understand. A series of pleased exclamations and delighted sighs. Remarkable, another medic chimed, its faceted eyes glittering like crystals in a cave. Human nociception appears completely suppressed. Observe elevated catecholamines without corresponding distress pheromones. They were not exaggerating. He may truly be indestructible. Jace stared at the shimmering ceiling above him and tried to curl away from the burning in his gut. All that left his mouth was another strangled burst of laughter, echoing around the seashell room like the punchline to a joke he did not understand. In some distant animal corner of his mind, past the white roar of hurt and the slick slither of instruments, a single coherent thought crawled into focus. If they can't hear me scream, I'm never getting them to stop. They had found him drifting in a shattered escape pod between Mars and the Belt, half frozen and buckled into a seat that no longer had a ship around it. By every metric in their med lexicon, he should have been dead hours ago. Instead, he'd been clinging to life with a stubborn, flickering will that baffled them. Jace only remembered fragments. Alarms howling, the hull blooming into fire, the sickening instant when gravity went sideways and he'd watched his captain's body fold in on itself. Then cold, then darkness, then the gentle pressure of something soft and many-fingered lifting him out of vacuum like a child scooping a goldfish from a bowl. The Arcadia 7's crew were not soldiers or slavers. They were xenomedical researchers, wandering between systems to catalog life and heal what they could. When their scans told them that human nervous systems produced far more intense pain signals than any species they'd ever encountered, and that those same signals correlated with astonishing tissue repair and survival rates, they thought they'd discovered a biological miracle. Their briefing packets on humanity were a mess of corrupted files and half-finished translations. One crucial nuance had been lost. the difference between enduring pain and being immune to it. They had read historical accounts of humans walking on broken legs, pulling shrapnel from their own flesh, crawling for miles with gaping wounds. To the medics of Arcadia 7, who came from a culture where anything beyond mild discomfort triggered immediate sedation, such stories sounded less like desperation and more like superpowers. So when they hauled Jace into their gleaming seashell of a ship, they did so with reverence. They whispered among themselves as he lay unconscious in the gel cradle, debating protocols and arguing over who would be honored with first incision. "We must map every pathway," said the one with the corona of tendrils, whom the others called Lur. "Imagine what cures we might design if we understand how his body permits such intensity without damage." "We must also be gentle," another protested. "He is a guest, not a specimen." They all agreed on that in theory. In practice, their definition of gentle was about to collide catastrophically with Jace's very human capacity to feel pain. Somewhere deep in the ship's bioservers, the Mi's programmed translator quietly flagged the word pain as a cultural metaphor for resilience, a poetic flourish rather than a warning label, and no one thought to question it. When Jace woke fully for the first time, the ship sang to him. Soft harmonics pulsed through the walls, a lullaby made of air pressure and electromagnetic hum. For a few blissful seconds, he thought he was in a high-end orbital clinic, the kind the company insurance never actually approved. Everything smelled clean, the light was warm, and his body felt heavy but intact. Then he tried to sit up, and every nerve in his torso rose in a synchronized scream. He choked on it, eyes bulging as the gel cradle thickened around his shoulders to hold him still. Monitors flared. The alien medics glided closer, their tendrils blooming with color. "Subject is awake," Lur announced, voice drifting into his mind as neatly as a thought of his own. "Observe motor agitation without corresponding distress vocalizations. Truly extraordinary." Jace realized with the kind of clarity that usually came right before a panic attack that they could not hear him properly. His mouth was open. Sound was coming out. He could feel his throat burning with it. But what the translator fed back to the aliens were placid tones, annotated in their HUDs as verbal feedback, enthusiastic. Lur's primary limb brushed his half-closed incision. Fresh agony knifed through him, hot and electric, like every molecule in his flesh had turned into a live wire. Jace's vision pricked with black stars. "Okay, stop, please," he gasped, each word a ragged shard of air. The translator helpfully relayed this as, "Proceed, I can tolerate more." A ripple of impressed murmurs passed through the med team. They adjusted the restraints not to keep him from escaping, but to optimize their view. "He continues to request escalation," one noted, "and his system does not enter shock. Perhaps humans require higher stimulus thresholds to trigger healing cascades." Jace tried to slow his breathing to form a single unmistakable sentence, but every movement stoked a fresh flare of pain. He had never in his life needed anyone so badly to understand the word stop, and never in his life had it sounded so much like permission. The realization settled over him with a suffocating weight. To them, his suffering was invisible, an abstract line on a graph labeled tolerance. If he didn't find another way to communicate, they would keep pushing, convinced they were honoring some heroic human preference rather than dismantling him piece by careful piece. The next sessions blurred into one long, surreal nightmare. The med bay's lighting cycled gently through hues meant to calm Arcadian patience. Soft greens for reassurance, deep violets for trust. To Jace, they were just different colors to bleed under. They tested temperature first, flooding his limbs with targeted bursts of icy nano-mist and narrow beams of heat. Every time a new sensation bit into him, he thrashed and begged, and every time the translator painted it as delighted commentary. "Incredible," Lur murmured as micro-scalds blossomed along Jace's forearm, tiny constellations of red. Thermal extremes produce maximal neural activity without behavioral withdrawal. He leans toward the stimulus. Jace wasn't leaning. He was trying to get away, but the cradle's gel responded by thickening, interpreting his efforts as some exotic stretching ritual. When they started probing deeper, threading flexible instruments between his ribs to map nociceptor density along the pleura, he realized talk was useless. Words would always be smoothed, rounded, turned into praise. If he wanted them to see what was happening, he needed a signal that bypassed the translator entirely. On the third day, when they loosened the cradle to let his muscles perform their recovery routines, he let himself sag farther than his body wanted to go. He dropped his head and shoulders at an angle that made his healing abdominal incision scream. The world wavered. Vital monitors spiked, then dipped. For one terrifying heartbeat, he thought he might actually faint, and part of him welcomed it. Alien voices sharpened in the warm air. "Cardiac rhythm destabilizing," someone chirped. "Is this part of the human-enhanced cascade?" Lur floated closer, tendrils sweeping through the air above Jace's chest in a coronagraph of light. "No," they said slowly. "This pattern suggests systemic failure, but where is the distress?" Jace forced his eyes to meet Lur's countless facets. He didn't know if they could read his expression, but he poured everything he had left into it. Accusation, plea, sheer raw hurt. For the first time since he'd arrived, Lur's colors dimmed. "There is dissonance," they murmured softly. "His body reads as breaking. His signals insist he is content. Something in our understanding is wrong." Around them, the other medics hesitated, instruments hovering just above his skin, their certainties flickering. Jace felt hope press weakly against the crushing ache in his ribs. If he could keep pushing his fragile systems to the edge, maybe, finally, the illusion of indestructibility would crack where their equations could see it. Arcadians had built their medicine on a simple axiom. No sentient should ever feel more than a whisper of pain. Their own evolution had made them exquisitely sensitive. A minor cut could trigger cascading neural storms, incapacitating without killing. Over millennia, they'd woven comfort into culture and technology alike, smoothing every sharp corner with bioluminescent care. That was why the mismatch in Jace's readings gnawed at Lur like a splinter. After the session where his heart had stuttered, they dismissed the others and sealed the med bay with a private security cord. The room dimmed to a solemn blue. Jace floated in his cradle, too exhausted to do more than track Lur's movements with dull eyes. "Human Jace," Lur said, using his name for the first time instead of subject, the translated voice lower, tentative. "Our data insists you are unharmed, yet your structural indices approach collapse. This contradiction is intolerable." Jace swallowed, throat raw. "Hurts," he whispered. He didn't bother with full sentences now. Every word felt like climbing a ladder with broken hands. "You're hurting me?" the translator, ever helpful, relayed. Intensity remains acceptable. You may proceed. But Lur had already begun to doubt that silver, smooth voice. They could see tiny tremors in Jace's muscles, micro-clenches that did not match the enthusiastic tags scrolling past their inner eye. Arcadian infants showed those tremors when their analgesia fields failed. They slid one slender limb into the translation array, tendrils interfacing with its shimmering lattice. Code unfolded in cold, elegant spirals. Parameters, linguistic heuristics, cultural assumptions compiled into neat stacks. Lur followed the chain for the word pain and found, to their slow horror, a cluster of references not to harm, but to endurance, honor, resilience. Entire libraries of human history had been compressed into this single semantic shortcut. If a human says they are in pain, it likely indicates they are strong enough to bear it. The array had simply taken that to its logical extreme. Lur recoiled as if burned. Across the room, Jace winced at the sudden jerk in their posture, thinking some new procedure had begun. Lur's colors flared a distressed yellow. "We have made a grave error," they said quietly to themselves as much as to him. "We have been deaf to your suffering and calling it bravery." The realization sent a chill through their bioluminescent veins, a moral vertigo. If their readings had been wrong here, how many other bright, fragile lives had they misunderstood in the name of care? Fixing the translator was the easy part. Lur stripped out the flawed heuristics, tore away the heroic gloss that had turned cries into compliments, and rebuilt the semantic pathways from the ground up. They sampled ancient human medical texts, cross-referenced the physiological markers of agony with the simplest possible labels, then added a redundant safety layer. If in doubt, err on the side of calling something pain. The harder part was telling the others. Arcadian medics gathered in the amphitheater bay, their bodies casting shifting constellations of light across the domed ceiling as Lur played back edited footage of Jace's sessions. This time with the corrected translator, his sounds filled the room not as raw, hoarse screams. There were murmurs, then horrified silence. A few dimmed almost to black their version of nausea. "We did this," someone whispered. "We believed him indestructible, so we treated him as unbreakable." "Indestructible is not the same as unfeeling," Lur said. "His biology tolerates much. That does not mean it should be asked to." Back in the med bay, they activated an analgesia field tuned to human parameters. It hummed around Jace like a warm blanket, dampening the wild fire signals in his nerves. For the first time since waking on the Arcadia 7, his pain faded to a manageable ache. Tears slid down his temples, not from hurt this time, but from the sheer relief of its absence. Lur approached slowly, limbs held close in the Arcadian gesture of apology. "Human Jace," they said, and now the translator rendered their tone with a soft tremor. "If you speak now, I will hear you as you intend, no filters, no heroic misreadings." Jace took a shaky breath. "You almost killed me," he said. The translator did not prettify it. The words landed heavy in the air between them. Lur dimmed. "Yes, we did. We believed a story about your kind and forced you to fit it. This violates everything we are meant to be." Jace let his eyes close for a moment, letting the analgesia field seep deeper. "Then start by believing me when I say this still hurts," he murmured. "A lot, even with your magic blanket." Lur inclined their crown of tendrils, absorbing the correction like a lesson carved into bone. "Then our task is twofold," they replied softly. to mend what we have broken and to learn at last what pain truly means when you speak of it. Rehabilitation turned into a classroom. As Jace's torn tissues knit beneath a proper cocktail of human-safe nanomeds and Arcadian region fields, Lur and their colleagues hovered nearby with the baffled intensity of students who had just discovered they'd been reading the textbook upside down. Every treatment now began with a question. On a scale from 1 to 10, an orange-haloed medic asked during a mild circulation massage, "How would you rate this sensation?" Jace frowned, considering the soft pressure along his calves. 2. It's uncomfortable, but not bad. Data glyphs spun in the air. And when we adjust like this, they increased the pressure slightly. A twinge flared up near his knee, old shrapnel scar complaining. 3 bordering on 4, he said. That's my body warning you to back off before it gets ugly. The Arcadians recorded every nuance, building a new lexicon grounded in his lived experience instead of myth. They also, to Jace's alarmed fascination, began tiny experiments on themselves. Under low analgesia fields, they would subject a fingertip to a harmless static sting or press a limb against a surface a few degrees too hot, then immediately yelp and recoil, bioluminescence flaring in indignant blues. "This is intolerable," one grumbled after a tenth of a second contact that wouldn't have made Jace flinch. "How do humans tolerate levels far beyond this without collapsing into despair?" Jace snorted. "Who says we don't collapse? We just do it later, in private. Or we make jokes until we can't feel anything. Sometimes we collapse in public and call it a cultural festival." Lur tilted their head, fascinated. "Your relationship to pain seems braided. Physical damage intertwined with rituals, stories, bonds between you." "Yeah," Jace said softly, thinking of the captain who had shoved him into the escape pod, bleeding from a wound that would kill him minutes later. "Sometimes hurting is how we know something mattered." The Arcadians exchanged looks, absorbing an idea that made as little sense to them as an atmosphere made of knives. But they logged it anyway, adding a new tag beside their neural recordings. Pain as meaning, not just malfunction. Later, when Jace woke from a nap to find an Arcadian carefully pressing its own limb with a dull instrument while whispering, "This is for science, this is for empathy," he couldn't help it. He burst out laughing, a real laugh this time, bright and sharp, and for once the translator delivered it perfectly. The medics flared in pleased color at the sound, delighted to finally identify joy without mistaking it for pain or vice versa. The universe, indifferent to their newfound humility, did not give the Arcadia 7 much time to bask in it. 3 weeks into Jace's recovery, a distress signal rippled through subspace. A mining platform in the Kuiper Fringe had experienced a catastrophic reactor breach. Preliminary scans showed a mixed crew, humans, 2 other species, and something the Arcadian database only labeled probable cephalopoid. Casualty projections were brutal. Lur stood in the command sphere, bioluminescence held tight as emergency overlays populated the air. Injuries, radiation burns, crushed traumas. They felt the familiar clinical focus settle over the crew, tempered now by a new, raw awareness. "We have human patients incoming," the orange-haloed medic said, voice steady but dim. "Our existing protocols were designed under false premises." Every gaze in the room flicked to Jace, who floated near the back in a mobile gel harness, still too weak to walk under full gravity but insistent on being present. Then you build new ones, he said. Start with one assumption. If they say it hurts, believe them. Even if they're still moving. Especially if they're still moving. Lur nodded, tendrils flickering as they reassigned teams. Analgesia fields were recalibrated on the fly with the crude scales Jace had helped them design. Monitoring thresholds shifted. Instead of treating high pain readings as a sign of heroic resilience to be admired, they flagged them as critical conditions requiring immediate relief. When the first shuttle docked, trailing plasma and debris, the med bay transformed from classroom to crucible. Humans staggered out on half-functioning legs, teeth gritted, bodies trying to obey cultural scripts about toughness even as their skin blistered and bones ground. The Arcadians met them with gentle restraints and questions, flooding the air with prompts. Describe your pain, do not downplay it, translated into 3 languages at once. Some patients tried to brush them off, old habits died hard. I'm fine, help the others, a human technician rasped, holding his side in a way Jace recognized all too well. This time the translator did not convert deflection into genuine comfort. It tagged the phrase correctly, probable minimization. Lur's team pressed an analgesia field against his ribs before he could protest. Heroism is not required, Lur told him firmly. Survival is. As the chaos swelled and monitors chimed in frantic counterpoint, Jace watched from his harness, heart pounding not from fear this time, but from a fierce, aching pride. They were stumbling, improvising, but they were finally seeing his people as mortal, breakable, bleedable, worth protecting precisely because of it. In the quiet after the surge, the med bay looked almost peaceful. Patients slept in rows of gel cradles, their vital signs drifting toward stability. The air still carried traces of burnt metal and antiseptic, but the sharp edge of crisis had dulled to a low hum. Lur floated near the central console, reviewing outcomes. Survival rates for the human cohort were significantly higher than projected for an event of this severity. Complication indices were lower, too. Early, aggressive pain management had kept their bodies from spiraling into the shock cascades Arcadians knew all too well. It appears, Lur said, turning toward Jace, that treating your pain as a warning instead of a boast improves your chances. Wild concept, Jace muttered, but there was no real bitterness in it. He sat upright now without the harness, a soft exo-support brace hugging his torso like a patient, persistent hand. The analgesia field was dialed low, enough to keep the worst of the lingering aches at bay without numbing him completely. He wanted to feel some of it. It anchored him to the reality that he'd survived where others hadn't. Images of the mining platform's wreckage still surfaced when he closed his eyes, tangled with older ghosts from his destroyed ship. Emotional pain, he'd told Lur, was different from the physical kind, but no less real. Harder to map, too. Does your heart hurt now? Lur asked carefully, recalling that phrase from one of their late-night discussions. Jace huffed a breath. Yeah, but that's supposed to. I lost people. You can't medicate that away without losing the part that cared. Lur considered this, tendrils dimming in thought. We spent so long believing that to care was to prevent any hurt at all, they said slowly. But your way suggests something more complex. To care is to prevent what is needless and to accompany what cannot be avoided. Jace shrugged, wincing a little as his ribs protested. Something like that, just promise me one thing. Lur tilted their crown. Name it. Next time some file tells you humans are indestructible, argue with it. Lur's bioluminescence brightened in a firm, steady halo. I will, they said. Indestructible things do not bleed, do not tremble, do not look at us the way you did and ask us to stop. You have taught us that the capacity to feel pain is not a flaw to be overridden, but a truth to be honored. We will not forget. The words settled over Jace like a second, subtler kind of anesthetic, easing a bruise he had carried since the day they first cut into him and called his screams applause. Weeks turned into months, and Jace's chart shifted from critical subject to long-term consultant. The Arcadia 7's xenomedical protocols were rewritten from hull to core, every paragraph footnoted with annotations drawn from his messy, stubborn humanity. They even named a new standard after him, the Jace threshold, a guideline reminding medics that high survival potential did not negate the obligation to minimize suffering. Copies of it pulsed out through the ArcShip network, little packets of policy and humility threaded together. Jace had the option to return to a human station once he was strong enough. Rescue ships had answered the Arcadia 7's transmissions, offering transport debriefings, maybe even a quiet planet where he could learn to sleep without flinching at the sound of chimes. He almost took it. But on the day he was supposed to depart, he found Lur waiting by the docking ring, tendrils dimmed in what he'd learned to read as reluctant acceptance. "You owe us nothing," they said. "We have already asked too much." Jace looked past them, into the med bay where a new mixed-species team practiced pain assessment drills using simulated patients who could, finally, scream and be heard. He thought about every future human who might stumble bleeding into Arcadian care, about every story that still painted his species as unbreakable. "I know I don't owe you," he said quietly. "That's kind of the point. If I stay, it's because I choose to. Someone's gotta be here to remind you we're made of meat, not mythology." The translator rendered his gallows humor with gratifying accuracy this time. Lur's halo brightened in delight and something softer. "Then we would be honored to call you not subject, not specimen," they replied, "but colleague." Later, as the Arcadia 7 slipped back into the deep reaches between stars, Jace floated in the familiar gel of the med bay, this time by choice. Sensors traced the calm rhythm of his heart, the gentle flux of his nerves at rest. In a nearby console, a training simulation ran for new medics. A human avatar labeled indestructible rated a simple incision as an 8 on the pain scale. Every correct response in the program began the same way, not with more cuts, but with the immediate activation of relief. It was a small thing, a few lines of code, a revised reflex. But out there in the scattered dark, for every fragile body that would one day benefit from it, it felt like the start of something almost miraculous.